Alright, in video 1 we covered how we could use Sonic Visualizer to capture the actual timing of these volleys. And when we capture this timing for the muzzle wave, we produce this table. And this table records where the event occurred, the time between subsequent events, the second derivative, which is the time between the deltas, and also the RPM. Now this was for one video, one volley, and a portion of that volley. We could take this same approach to every video or any subset of videos that we choose and look at the data. And there's numerous ways to look at the data. So for example, if we wanted to look at just this data for the deltas, then we could plot that in a graph. And in this case, what we have is a stem plot, meaning that there's nothing more than you plot the point, plot the line, and that's for everything. In this case, on the left side over here, we've plotted the delta t, or the time between shots, and we see that there's only 7 because for 8 shots there's only 7 differences. In this case we're looking at event 5G, which is a third burst from the 5th volley for this video, which I have given a mnemonic of under. And we can see from this plot that for the last 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 differences, things were pretty close. In fact, they only changed by 2.5 milliseconds on average, up and down. But for the first 2 or first 3 shots, we have the variances going all the way up from 0 to 15 milliseconds, which, as I've mentioned before, isn't that big a deal, but this gives us a visual representation for the data in the table. And depending upon whether you're a numbers person or a visual person, or what you want to look at, you can choose. There's 50 different types of plots that you can choose. Now if we wanted to combine multiple plots from multiple videos, then we could take and produce something that looks like this. And this is a good graph for comparing the same volley, which in this case it's the third burst of the 5 volley, same one we've been working on, but I am comparing 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 different videos, and I've given them all mnemonics. You'll probably recognize some of them. One is the Raymond page, one is the Hispanic ladies in the taxi over there on Mandalay Bay Road, one is the guy up in the northeast side of the sound booth where you can hear him say it's electrical, and there's 2 of them, is he and his girlfriend or wife. Oh, I thought I fixed that. Well, we'll just ignore it for now. I guess we're using up too much processing power. Cut this one off here, maybe that'll help. Well, see, are there any others to get rid of? No, we'll leave those for now and just deal with it. In this graph, I've got an absolute time where each event occurred. And then what we do is compare them from video to video, assuming that they all start at the same time. Now they don't. That is, a muzzle blast for one video will begin or is recorded at a time different than another video, simply because it takes the time from the recording point to the video source. Yeah, boy, my tongue's tired here. Sound propagates from the source to the destination. In this case, the distances are all different. But we'll ignore that, because working with absolute values for timing is just a nightmare, as there's no real definite source of alignment on any of them to give a real absolute value any accuracy. So I work with the relative values, and that gives me a lot greater flexibility. Now from this graph we can see that the 5 of the 6 all are in pretty good agreement, which is what I would expect for a very short volley like this, because if there's any movement in the recorder which would produce a difference in timing, it's only going to occur over a very short time frame, namely, a little more than 0.6 seconds. However, in this case we see that this top bar is way out of line, and that's for East F, which is, it's a mnemonic for a video that's in the front row on the east side of the venue. And I have no clue at the moment, what's wrong with it, or whether it indicates some other sort of phenomena. I have to look into it. So this is a very quick way of looking at whether or not the data you've collected from multiple videos is reasonable, or if there's some phenomena that needs to be looking at. And in most of these cases you can see that there's probably less than 3 milliseconds difference in these lines. If we wanted to look at it if we wanted to compare all these but in a little bit different fashion, we might choose to plot them all exactly on top of one another. And in this case you're going to see that there's something that sticks out. Once again, that's the green bar, which is the East F video. So it's just a different way of looking at it. You may prefer one form, or you may prefer the other. If we were to do this for more than one volley, if we were to do it for many volleys, and perhaps indeed all the volleys, we might produce a graph that looked like this. Where what we have done is plotted RPM, which is simply that little formula over the deltas between them, and we're going to have to magnify it a little bit. And this is for rounds per minute relative to October 1st at 10 p.m. So in this case we've gone and said that we're going to start this at 10 p.m. and these times on the bottom are going to be seconds relative to 10 p.m. So at 10 p.m., I think it was 10 p.m., or did we say 05? Yeah, 10 p.m. We can see that this is volley 1, 2, 3, 4. There's a gap. Sometime later we get volley 5, which consists of 3 bursts. Sometime later we get a volley which again consists of 2 or 3 little bursts, and those are the hallway shots. And then we get volley 6, which consists of 2 different subsets. And anytime there's a gap of more than about 0.3 seconds, I go ahead and create another grouping, because otherwise you get a lot of these big spikes that are, just dominate the graph, and it becomes less usable. So anyway, we're at volley 6. Here's volley 7. And as you can see in this case, we're plotting more than, or actually you can see it all over the case. We're plotting, let's go back to 6B, and we're plotting more than one video. In this case there's 2 videos, each one represented by a different color, and you can see that in some portions of that volley or burst they don't agree. For 7 we have again 2 in there, 1 purple, 1 brown, and they agree, pretty close. So volley 7, at least for the 2 videos that we're looking at here, are in real good agreement. And then we go on to 8A, 8B, 9, which has 3 little things, 9A, 9B, 9C, and I labeled them down here with a count, and I lay them exactly on top of them where they start. So like with volley 7, if they agree very well, then they're going to form one number that looks like a bold. If they don't, then they're going to be a little obscure like that one, but we can still make out the count and the name. Alright, so we were at 9, there's 10. 10 is the one that everybody recognizes as being pretty variable in timing. And then we got 11, A and B, and then finally 12 with a color code index on the top here. And so this would give us the timing for the entire events between 10:05 and 10 whatever it works out to be, 900 and some seconds. And this way we can get the big picture. Now, not plotted on here are the single shots from the 308 between volleys 4 and 5 or at the end. Now this is RPM, and it goes everywhere from 1400 down to, excluding the single shots, about 300. So that's a pretty big range. And you can immediately get a sense of how regular the volleys were or irregular, and what the timing between the volleys are. And this is all because I took the time to mark all of the muzzle blasts for dozens of videos, and I did that manually. But once I have that data, then I can do a lot of different things with them. And this is a graphical representation. And so over here, you start to look at this graph and you say, okay, well, between this end of volley 3 and the start of volley 4, that's about the same time as this gap, but yet the gap between volley 1 and 2 is substantially larger. What was going on? Did he take a break, or was there something else going on in there? Maybe that was where Campos came in and he decided to shoot a few rounds down the hallway also, but they're not recorded on any video to any extent. And here you can see that this is the gap between volley 4 and volley 5 is large, and that's when those single shots occurred, but just a huge time for something to happen. And then once again back here, we can see that the gap here, here, and here, are all pretty regular. So once he started firing down the hallway, he kept this very regular time between the volleys. But yet over here between volleys 5 and volley 6, there's a gap there, meaning either one person or multiple persons took their time in shifting from one volley to the next. Similarly over here between 9 and 10, and again from 10 to 11, and then it goes back to this nice little regular gap. So when you look at this from an investigative standpoint, you start to ask questions of, well, what was happening this time and this time that was different than the other times that didn't produce gunfire, but could have been related to something else. Maybe he had to take a leak or take some water, or maybe he was running from room to room, or maybe he was doing something else. So this big picture views like this is very useful for the big picture type questions. It's not so good on managing the details of individual volleys. And again, this is a graphical representation. If we take a closer look here, i.e. we limit our field of view to just some volleys, and in this case we're going to go from volley 4 to volley 13, and we're going to be comparing the Oasis Apartments and the Raymond Page video. So in this case, I was interested in asking the question, how do the Raymond Page timings, both of the volleys and between the volleys, stack up against the same volleys and timing at the Oasis apartment? Now this is a pretty big picture graph, and the resolution is on the order of seconds. So if there's any small differences, they're not going to show up in this, but if there's big differences, then they're readily visible. What is apparent on this, though, is that if we look closely at, say, volley 10 here, and again we're looking at the Raymond Page and the Oasis Apartments, that there's not a lot of difference up and down, namely in RPM, between those two. Although here we see that the blue one extended more, and there's something needed to be looked at there. So this is just another graph for all the volleys for the muzzle blast timings that tells us, whether you need to look at something or not. Let's see, there's one other way you can look at this, and this is a pretty poor example, but if we go back to the third burst of the fifth volley, and in this case we're looking at again 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 videos, you can compare them the same as we were comparing this all in one, but in this time we plotted the deltas, the delta between shots, as lines between points. And it's just a different way of looking at it. Sometimes these are useful, sometimes the other form is useful. The other thing you can do is put all that data into spreadsheets and run calculations on it. And I've done that and wrote a little program, not so little, that generates an Excel spreadsheet, although I use OpenOffice. So, and in this, I made a selection of all the videos I have that I wanted to look at this specific time, and I've listed them here and broke them down into whether they're from the venue or from an external timing of a machine gun, or from a bump fire, or from the M240 series of machine guns. And in this case I wanted to have not only the venue but some other information to compare with. And for all that data, I can look at these list volleys, and you don't probably recognize any of these because they're from external videos. And with this I can say, well, I've got all these videos to look at. Which ones can, what did that third burst of the fifth volley look like for all those? And I can click on it because I have them hyperlinked in there and say, okay, these are the videos. This is all for 5G, which is the third burst of the fifth volley. And I go along and I count up the rounds fired by simply counting the number of muzzle blasts, and the gap measures the time since the last event for that video. The duration is the duration of that event, which is 5G, where it begins, where it ends. These are video relative times. What the average delta is, as we discussed in the first video. Standard deviation, RPM. Rank is a number that I apply to the events to give me a sorting order. In this case, there's nothing to it. And then I have to do several techniques and algorithms to make these things line up, and these numbers are included here to come up with what I think is a reasonable estimate of when in the absolute global time that event occurred, if that video were at a specific location that all videos were at. So for example, I could arrange this number such that all videos have their timings relative to the Corey Langdon taxi driver. And this gives me the ability to carefully look at these numbers and say, oh, there's a problem very, very quickly, although it's numbers, not graphs. So for example, in this case, we see that, okay, they all have 8 counts. If one of them had 1, that would be, a problem. We can look at the durations. The gap is not really important in this case. And we see that the duration of that volley is 0.68 plus, back once again, that E-Steph thing which we've seen before has got a problem, and so I'll mark that for further exploration. But the other ones all agree that it's about 0.68 and a few milliseconds. And the average delta, once again, they all relate, and the standard deviation is all the same. So with the exception of E-Steph, these other 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 videos all agree very good for this event. And you can see that from the RPM. Over your way to the right of this, I've got some notes that were produced by the alignment algorithms to tell me how this video was aligned. In this case, this was Corey Langdon video, and it was aligned to East F 5th volley. Well, that may not be too good an idea because East F, we know, has a few problems, but that's the way it was working. Alright. So if we click back to the table of contents here, and we ask ourselves, well, what videos is this scenario looking at? And we can have any dozens of scenarios with any videos and volleys and the whole 9 yards. It's a great what-if tool. I can say, show me a cross-reference for this. And this cross-reference on the top lists every volley and sub-volley. And on the left here we have all the videos that I was interested in looking at. And we can see this little chart of, if we read the top down, we can see which event is in which video. And if we read left to right, we can see that this video contained all these events. And so in the case of a video which I've labeled middle, it contains volley 1, 2A, 2B, 2C, 2D, 3A, and 3B. Now, just because there's not an X here doesn't mean that the video doesn't contain it. It's just that I haven't gone through and marked the muzzle blast, or can't for some reason. And so this gives me a very quick indication of which video I will need to go look at if I'm interested in a particular event. So if we go back to the table of contents over here, you can also, what I've also done here is taken, and I click on this, all those events for all those videos, and I've sorted them in time. And what this does is give me a quick way of comparing all of them straight down, and if I'm careful, I can find quickly things that don't match. So let's look at column C, and that gives me a count. So for volley 0, which is the first shots, I have 3 videos here, and they all have 6 counts. That's good. Come down to volley 1, and I have 3 100s and 1 9. So in that case, it's a video that I have to go look at, because obviously I didn't complete marking all of the, well, I didn't complete it, or couldn't complete it, all of the muzzle blast timings. In 15, you can see here that 2A contains 15 counts, 2B contains 10, 2C contains 7, 2D contains 16, and on down. Now volley 11 is a little strange because it's very hard to mark the muzzles on a lot of the videos. So we can see that, well, 11A was pretty good, except on this video, which marked 17 instead of 25 rounds in their little variants. And then we go back to volley 12, which had 44 rounds for all of these videos. And we can look at the various characteristics on this and do what you want with it. It's a very good way of comparing the data, calling out the bad stuff, and refining the good stuff. I'm looking at what I have or have not covered here. This program also generates probably for this scenario a couple hundred different individual worksheets, and we can look at the data contained in each of them. The intro worksheet just gives me kind of a summary of who authored it, in this case me, and what it's about, what the scenario is about, where the plots are saved, where the source of the data comes from, which videos are there, and how many different actual locations are used in the calculation of certain parameters inside this. For example, Raymond Page, moves up and down a little bit on the boulevard, therefore he's going to have multiple locations. The tall ace of spades is continually walking, so he is going to have dozens of locations. And those locations are important because it helps determine the distance to the shooter, because as you move, the timing between rounds changes. In fact, it's one of the primary ways you can tell if a camera or a phone is walking, is that as they walk away from the shooter, the time between rounds grows. If you're walking slow, it's not real noticeable, but over the course of 30 seconds, you could easily end up with a 15 millisecond difference between the end of one volley and the beginning of the next for the tall ace of spades versus the same exact sequence in another video. Go back to the table of contents. Then we look at kind of an overall view here of what videos are in it, the duration of the video, how long it is in hours, minutes, seconds, and milliseconds, the number of individual events that were pulled from that video, and within those events, the number of individual muzzle blasts or points of interest that were pulled. You can totally this up, and you can see that it's approaching several thousand individual events that have been manually marked by myself in this collection of videos. And then over here, this gives a rough idea of the number of seconds that had to be added to or subtracted from the video relative times to bring this video into alignment into the global absolute time frame of 10, 10:05, 10:10, that sort of stuff. And then if we look at locations, this is a list of the actual just videos that were used with a little bit more detailed information about them, which is kind of irrelevant at this point. And then we have a concordance, and I generate both for the videos versus the events and the events versus the videos. So in this case, the events versus the videos, we see that for sub volley 2B, these videos contain it. And if we were to go up here and we'd say middle contains these events. It's just one, it's a different way of looking at things that is much like the timeline XREF, cross-reference. This is just an alternate view on the detailed timeline, where I've tried to combine all the sub-volleys into one, which is what people typically do. So, for example, volley 2, which really is composed of 4 sub-volleys, I put all of them together, and the total count is 95, versus having this very detailed timeline where volley 2 has 2A, 2B, C, all that sort of stuff. Oops. This is a rate of fire which looks at the deltas between them, and it measures, the RPM, the mean delta, standard deviation, variance, median, kurtosis, and skew. And then that's the group number, which theoretically is a number which groups these things into similar packets, shall we say. So the closer these numbers, the closer these are to being the same. Sometimes, because of the volume of data that gets collected and the length of time it takes to do an analysis, it's really not practical to do every analysis by hand. And so I've created a program that uses the Python libraries SciPy, NumPy, and Librosa to semi-automate some of the analysis. And what I did was took that huge database of Muzzle data, and I imported that into the program, as well as particular videos, and then I wrote routines that would allow me to look at specific features or feature sets or characteristics or profiles of segments of the video. For example, in this simple case, I'm looking at the information collected from the video I call Oasis, which is the Oasis apartment, for a portion of volley 7. And what I've done is I've taken a spectrogram, which is, these nice colors here, very, very similar to what Sonic Visualizer does, only this is done with the Librosa library that has routines in it for calculating spectrograms. And I've laid out a spectrogram, then I imported the muzzle data, and I marked on the spectrogram where the muzzle blasts were. So in these little blue triangles. So in this case you can see that these brighter red objects here are the muzzle blasts. And then with a waveform plot I similarly marked with red lines where the muzzle data is. And the object here was to develop an algorithm that would take this waveform and do something with it that would automatically detect the potential sonic blasts. Now in this case it marked, let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12 points for possible sonic blasts. And it didn't do a very good job of separating out them, because up here up front there's 3 areas there that don't really look like sonic shock waves, rather. But on the other case it did pretty good, because here's a sonic shock wave. There's probably a reflection of one. Yeah, there's probably one in there. But anyway, so then what I'll do is I take those numbers which are automatically generated and apply other algorithms to, and just delete the ones that don't fit the further criteria. Sometimes, and I do this because sometimes areas of a video are so complex that manually I can't separate it out, and I need to apply a bunch of algorithms to eke the data out. So for example, let's see, in this case I have the same thing here, but the sonics weren't marked. But this is from Ray, and this is for volley 9, the third burst. On here you can see that I've marked the deltas between the muzzle things, which is kind of a nice little thing. And then what happened was I applied various different methods of detecting these percussive events, both the muzzle and the sonic waveform, and then this data I can use in evaluating what type of techniques I'm going to have to apply to this volley to extract out the information. When it gets really complex, it can often take several hours of calculations to extract out all the stuff I need. For example, in this case what we're looking at is the Raymond Page video volley 4, and we have the standard spectrogram with the blue triangles marking the known muzzle blasts, again the waveform where they're marked. But then what I did was I went and applied algorithms that separated the foreground sound from the background sounds, or separates the percussive events from the harmonic events, and came up with these brightly colored, they're still spectrograms, but you can see what happened is it took the entire video segment of sound and it extracted out just the percussive events, leaving them no sound where the black regions are in the background. And so sometimes this can give a greater contrast to what events are occurring, because voices and music and sirens and all those types of events are harmonic in nature, and while they may have some percussive component to them, they're not very much like gunshot sounds. So this is just more techniques for extracting data out of hard situations. And here we can see that once I extracted out the foreground and the background, I also looked at the remainder of the sounds that were left, and it actually turned out to be better than either the foreground or the background extraction. So you just never know which techniques are going to be the most useful. And then once again, I ran an automatic algorithm to detect the onsets of these things, which did an extremely good job of finding them on the remainder portion of the separation of the harmonic and percussive foreground-background algorithm. This is almost perfect, in fact. So a lot of times this automated processing can... Oh, and then from this, I'd extract the data out and compare it and manage it and merge it back into the database. Because a lot of times you get to doubting yourself. You say, well, is that really a muzzle blast, or is that really a sonic shock wave or anything? And this way there's some semi-independent third-party verification based upon some objective data other than what you think you know. In this particular instance, I applied 20 different algorithms to see what would produce the best results, basically. So, for example, this waveform of the signal, if you separate out the percussive portions, which are the up and down signals, then you can see there's a much greater signal to noise ratio, but on the downside you may be losing some of the really small amplitude ones, which have to be looked at in the frequency domain anyway, which would be what happens down here. Okay, well anyway, what I wanted to do, in summary, what I wanted to do with this video is show that once you've collected the data or marked all the muzzle datas and things like that, there's a tremendous amount of information that you can be presented by doing graphs or tables or all these other algorithms that are available to you. It just takes time and effort and hard work. Anyway, that's it for this evening.